In early 1951, the United States government dropped 5 nuclear bombs on American soil. Operation Ranger marked the beginning of American nuclear testing on U.S. soil. But to understand why the U.S. made the decision to start dropping nukes practically in its own backyard, we need to go back to the years right after World War II when the Cold War panic was setting in. Most people don't know this, but the Cold War didn't start with spies and tension. It started with a bang, the Soviet Union's bang, to be exact. In 1949, just 4 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the Soviet Union exploded its own atomic bomb. For Washington, this was a nightmare scenario. The US was no longer the only nuclear power on Earth, and that was a big problem. Suddenly, America wasn't ahead, it was tied, and the race wasn't just about stockpiling weapons anymore. It was about proving who could build them faster, test them better, and deploy them first. If the Soviets were sprinting, America had to sprint faster. The US had already been testing bombs in the Pacific, places like Bikini Atoll and Eniwetok, but those islands were far away. Tests took months of planning and required massive logistics to move men and material. It was expensive, slow, and becoming increasingly impractical in a world where the threat felt more immediate every day. What the US needed now was speed, flexibility, and control. That meant finding a place closer to home, a permanent testing ground on American soil, where they could fire off bombs whenever they wanted, without having to cross oceans or wait on weather windows in the South Pacific. So military planners started scanning maps. They needed land, lots of it, empty, dry, and isolated, somewhere with low population, clear skies, and total government control. The answer was Nevada. The southern part of the state had thousands of square miles of desert, barely inhabited, already under military watch. And just as important, it was only a short flight from Los Alamos and military command centers. The Nevada Proving Ground was born, and the tests they launched would be called Operation Ranger. The plan included 5 high-altitude airbursts designed to evaluate new nuclear bomb designs. But even in their rush, planners had to make some strange choices, because while the Nevada desert checked most of the boxes, there was one major problem they couldn't ignore, or at least, they should have paid more attention to it. So why, out of all the places in the American West, did they decide to test nukes just a stone's throw from a rising tourist city like Las Vegas? You'd think there'd be a rule: no nuclear bombs near cities. But when the US chose the Nevada desert for atomic testing, they picked a site barely 65 miles from one of the fastest-growing tourist destinations in the country. At the time, Las Vegas was turning into something special. New hotels, neon signs, slot machines, celebrities. It was the glitzy face of post-war America. But just over the mountains, the government was preparing to turn the desert into a nuclear sandbox. So why take that risk? Well, from a logistical standpoint, Nevada was nearly perfect. The land was federally owned, the skies were clear, and the military already operated out of nearby bases like Nellis Air Force Base. There were roads, infrastructure, and just enough remoteness to give officials confidence that fallout wouldn't be a problem. And then there was the money. The tests brought jobs, contracts, and government funding. Local officials didn't complain, they leaned into it. Vegas began marketing itself as a place where you could watch atomic tests with your morning coffee. Hotels hosted dawn bomb parties on their rooftops. People literally cheered when the sky lit up. But there was one big assumption holding the whole thing together: that the radiation from these bombs would stay put, that winds, atmosphere, and geography would keep the fallout contained inside the testing zone. They were wrong. Even during Operation Ranger, the government started to see warning signs. Fallout didn't always stay where it was supposed to. Dusty particles of radioactive material drifted farther than expected, sometimes into towns, farms, even into Las Vegas itself. But instead of pulling back, they kept going. And to make everything sound less dangerous, they gave the whole operation a name that downplayed the risks: and sold the illusion of control. But why Ranger? Why not something more bomb-appropriate? The answer reveals a lot about how the US wanted people to feel about nuclear bombs, and, maybe more importantly, how they didn't want them to feel. The world is used to military operations getting fierce names like Trinity, Crossroads, Castle Bravo, names that sound like they belong to dangerous missions. But the word Ranger is neutral, non-threatening. It doesn't scream nuclear weapon, and that was the point. After the public backlash from earlier Pacific tests, US officials wanted a term that lowered the temperature, something that suggested order and familiarity, not radioactive chaos. By keeping the name casual, the government could downplay the severity of what was actually going on. Multiple atomic detonations within reach of major US cities. Even the individual bomb tests under Ranger had simple, recycled names: Able, Baker, Easy, Baker 1, and Fox. These weren't new. They'd already been used in prior test series like Operation Crossroads. Using the same names again served a purpose. It made the tests sound routine. Just another step in a long-running scientific program. It was all part of a broader strategy of making nuclear weapons feel normal. If the public got too scared, politicians would face pressure to stop testing. But if the public got used to it, saw nukes as just another tool in the military toolbox, then testing could continue without resistance. But here's the problem. Behind these harmless-sounding names were some of the most unpredictable bombs the US had ever detonated. The scientists were still experimenting, trying new core designs, new altitudes, new configurations. And during Ranger, they pushed the limits. One test in particular, the final shot in the series, went well beyond what was expected. So what happens when a test designed to demonstrate control ends up being too powerful? That brings us to the moment when even America's nuclear experts got caught off guard. By the time they reached the fifth and final test of Operation Ranger, everything was supposed to be dialed in, predictable. Instead, they got a blast more powerful than anyone had planned for. On February 6, 1951, the test, codenamed Fox, was detonated above Frenchman Flat. Engineers had expected a yield of about 22 kilotons. That was already a decent punch, slightly stronger than the Hiroshima bomb, but still manageable for the data they needed. What they got was something more. The explosion produced a yield that exceeded their expectations, and that's a problem when you're dealing with nuclear weapons.
0.
A few extra kilotons might not sound like much, but at that level, every uptick means more shockwave, more heat, and more fallout carried higher into the atmosphere. This was about control, and in that moment, they completely lost it. The Fox shot created a massive fireball and a mushroom cloud that rose nearly 40,000 feet into the air. Radiation monitors scrambled to track the fallout. Dust from the blast zone began drifting far beyond the expected safety zones. Instruments recorded levels that weren't just high, they were dangerous. The problem was that the models used to predict wind drift and radiation dispersal were still incredibly basic. Computers were in their infancy, and weather modeling was little more than guesswork. So when fallout began heading east, toward populated areas and military installations, no one could stop it. But while officials worried about data, something else had already been set in motion. Because just hours after the detonation, soldiers were being ordered straight into the blast zone. Why? Because part of the test, the part no one ever talked about publicly, wasn't just about bombs. It was about people. It's one of the most disturbing parts of Operation Ranger and one of the least discussed. The US military didn't just test nuclear bombs at Frenchman Flat. They also tested soldiers. Right after the Fox detonation, units of American troops were sent into the blast area. Not for rescue operations, not to secure the perimeter. They were ordered to walk into the fallout zone on purpose. This was no accident. It was a calculated part of the operation. The goal was to see what would happen. Military leaders wanted to know how troops would function on a nuclear battlefield, whether they could fight, maneuver, survive. They didn't fully understand the long-term effects of radiation yet, but rather than simulate it, they chose to gather real data using real men. Hundreds of soldiers, many of them young, barely trained recruits, were told to march toward ground zero, often with no protective gear. No hazmat suits, no respirators, just regular uniforms and gas masks that offered zero protection against radiation. Eyewitness accounts describe troops crouching in trenches during the blast, then rising and walking across a scorched landscape just hours after detonation. The ground was still hot. Some reported the sand had melted into glass. Geiger counters clicked wildly, but orders were orders. They called these exercises atomic battlefield maneuvers. And it wasn't just walking. In later test series, they practiced digging foxholes, storming mock enemy positions, even running toward the plume like it was just smoke from a regular bomb. Ranger was the prototype for all that. It laid the groundwork for using soldiers as live test subjects under real nuclear conditions. What most of these troops didn't know, and what many didn't find out for years, was that they'd been exposed to radiation doses far higher than anything considered safe. In the decades that followed, thousands of these veterans developed cancers, autoimmune diseases, and other health complications. Many died without ever being told what had been done to them. Those who lived long enough to fight for compensation often found the government unwilling to acknowledge what happened in the Nevada desert. But the soldiers weren't the only ones affected, because while the military focused on blast effects and troop performance, there was another group being hit by fallout. People who had never signed up for anything. So just how far did the radiation really go? While the soldiers at Frenchman Flat were ordered into radioactive zones, they at least knew something had happened. Thousands of ordinary Americans didn't even get that much, because the fallout from Operation Ranger didn't stay neatly within military fences. It didn't respect borders or warning signs. The radiation cloud that rose from those 5 atomic blasts was carried east by the wind, right into the path of small towns, ranches, and farms. These people, who lived in places like St. George, Utah, and Caliente, Nevada, had no idea what was drifting down onto their homes, their food, and their children. They were never warned. They were never evacuated. Most weren't even told there had been a test. Today, we call them the downwinders. After the Fox shot, the final and most powerful blast of Operation Ranger, radioactive particles fell from the sky like invisible dust. In some towns, it settled on laundry hanging out to dry. Kids played outside while beta particles coated the grass. Farmers milked cows whose feed had been contaminated, sending radioactive iodine into the milk supply. In the days after the tests, people began to notice strange things: nausea, hair loss, rashes, but the government denied any danger. Officials told residents not to worry, that the radiation levels were negligible and safe. They weren't. Over time, cancer rates in these communities began to skyrocket. Leukemia, thyroid cancer, breast cancer, multiple myeloma, diseases that had once been rare became heartbreakingly common. In some places, entire families got sick. For years, locals had no idea why. Doctors were puzzled. Some blamed it on bad luck. But a clever few started to whisper about the nuclear tests, the ones no one talked about. It wasn't until decades later that declassified documents confirmed what many downwinders already suspected. They had been exposed to significant radiation doses during and after Operation Ranger. But here's where it gets worse. Even after the government knew fallout was reaching these towns, they kept testing. They launched dozens more atomic blasts over the following years, above ground, in the open air, as if the first 5 hadn't already proven what could go wrong. So if they knew the danger, if the data was clear, why did the testing program not only continue but grow bigger? That takes us to the most unsettling part of the whole story. Most people think Operation Ranger was a one-time event, a quick 5-shot experiment in the desert. But in truth, it was just the start of something far bigger and more dangerous. Because once the military saw that nuclear testing could be done right here in Nevada, close to labs, bases, and decision-makers, they never looked back. Just 2 months after the last Ranger detonation, planning began for Operation Buster Jangle, a much larger series of tests that would include underground troops, new bomb designs, and even live animals placed near Ground Zero to study blast effects. Over the next 12 years, the Nevada test site would host over 100 above-ground nuclear explosions. These were not tiny blasts. They ranged from small tactical nukes to multi-megaton bombs that lit up the sky like artificial suns. It became routine. It became normalized. Soldiers trained in the glow of mushroom clouds. Civilians in Las Vegas watched the sky turn white, clapping and cheering like it was a 4th of July firework. The U.S. even started conducting civil defense exercises to show Americans how to survive a nuclear war. Duck and cover drills in schools, public broadcasts explaining how to build fallout shelters in your backyard. The message was, nuclear weapons are part of life now. Get used to it. But not everyone accepted it. By the late 1950s, scientists and activists started pushing back. Linus Pauling, a Nobel Prize-winning chemist, spoke out about the dangers of radiation. Local doctors in Utah and Nevada began collecting data on cancer clusters. Journalists dug into classified records. And little by little, the public started to understand that nuclear fallout wasn't something that stayed out in the desert. It was in the air, the water, the soil, the milk. It was in them. By the time the U.S. signed the Limited Test Ban Treaty in 1963, banning atmospheric nuclear tests, the damage had already been done. Thousands of square miles were contaminated. Entire communities had been exposed. Veterans were dying of mysterious illnesses. And the American public was left to ask a haunting question. How much did the government know, and when? That question still doesn't have a full answer. But it all started with Ranger. Operation Ranger represented a shift in how nuclear technology was tested, managed, and ultimately understood. For the first time, atomic weapons were trialed on continental U.S. soil, close to growing cities, military bases, and civilian infrastructure. This choice brought the realities of the atomic age out of distant atolls and into the American mainland. It showed that the Cold War would no longer be fought on the outskirts. It would now shape landscapes, policies, and public perception at home. The data collected from Ranger would influence how future weapons were designed, how fallout was modeled, and how military training adapted to nuclear conditions. It also raised early questions about long-term exposure, safety protocols, and the responsibilities that come with advancing powerful technologies. In that way, Ranger wasn't just a test, it was a signal. A quiet marker in history, showing that the age of controlled detonation had begun, and that what we choose to test often shapes what we choose to live with. If you want to follow the story of Orange Herald, check out our video here.